Hello, St. Michael's. It's Reverend Michelle with this week's overview for our small group Bible study. Today, as you can see, I am not in New York, but I am in Florida. My wife, Anna, and I are here for the funeral of her father, who died in August. Now, this week, we finished with our study of Hosea. This is week 7 of 8, but we're going to wrap up Hosea this week and move on to our conclusion next week. And we've been reading the words of this prophet Hosea, who utilizes the metaphor of marriage to help us understand covenant and the metaphor of adultery to help us understand the breaking of that covenant. Not a helpful metaphor for many reasons, but even I have to say that I think the following point is clearly made, that those who witnessed the decline of Israel saw that it was the political leaders' departure from God, both in worship and in practice, that caused the steady decline and eventual downfall of this nation state. It was the breaking of the covenant, the leaders who moved away from a reliance and trust in Yahweh, the God of saving deeds, that resulted in the adultery, which is defined as the chasing after promises of prosperity and power. Now, the ancient Israelite God Yahweh was not a God of immediate gratification. As a matter of fact, we may recall that the ancient Israelites complained during their journey through the wilderness, and this was endlessly that they complained to Moses about, I think the trope we use is at least we had onions in Egypt. We use this to describe the impatience and anxiety expressed by these people in the wilderness, that at least in slavery, they had what they needed. And in the wilderness, they were unsure all the time, thus needing to trust in God. But Yahweh's ways have a longer arc to them than immediate gratification, one that we cannot always see. And therefore, the leadership that's required to carry that out must be able to endure the intolerance and frustration that people express while also offering hope. We've come to understand that that's how God works. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. told us that the moral arc of the universe is long, which is a way of paraphrasing all the prophets. Now, a grasp of the geopolitical circumstances of the second half of the 8th century BCE is helpful for us to appreciate the rationale of what Israel was doing and why they were doing it, what they had to navigate as political and military leaders, because they were building up an acquaintance with this harsh northern neighbor, the Assyrian Empire. And in order to do that, they felt that they had to bridge over the boundary between them and offer treaties with them, and because of the anxiety that the government felt in Israel at the time. But as we all know too well, political leaders are often more interested in power and popularity than they are interested in actual civic leadership. And this is a demonstration of that in ancient Israel, the partnering with the Assyrian Empire, which eventually took them over. We could spend time on the psychology of those who enter politics as a way of bolstering their own egos, but that would be a whole course unto itself. But it's clear that that's what we're talking about, is how the leadership fails in a pursuit of its own popularity and power. Those who enter political leadership for reasons other than a genuine care for the people they're called to lead, or who don't have enough strength to withstand the machinations of bureaucratic systems, are at risk for becoming the problem. That maybe in their earlier years, they genuinely thought that they would want to correct problems, but because of their inability to withstand the situation, they become the problem themselves. They promise immediate satisfaction to people in order to garner support from them for themselves and their continued power, rather than helping to build a future that will strive to please God. Specifically in ancient Israel, this is the case. In particular, according to Amos in chapter 5, a future that not only includes, but is built upon justice for the poor and the marginalized. And that's how we read the Hebrew scriptures. In our chapter this week, it focuses on ways in that we idolize that which we humans believe is our own self-interest. And I say believe is our own self-interest because our actual self-interest is in this long moral arc of the universe, is in the justice for the poor and the marginalized. That is our actual self-interest. But in the short-sighted self-interest that we have, we focus and we idolize in a way that is not helpful for the larger moral arc, nor for God's purposes. And the specific way that we study this in Hosea is through the worship of the Canaanite god Baal. This is one example of this idolization in a few ways. First, in the decision to shift worship practices. This was a jealous move, if you remember, by Jeroboam I to shore up his own power as the first king of the northern kingdom. And then the continuation of those practices by subsequent kings to continue shoring up that power. Second, we see the conflation of worship that resulted in a dilution and weakening of people's everyday practices. And third, in the outright self-centeredness expressed in the worship of a god of agriculture, which in that society was akin to worshiping a god of prosperity and a god of fertility. So the question we have before us is, how do we idolize our own self-interest? How do we make that the reason for which we worship God? Now, I hope you're taking care of yourselves this week. It's been a very difficult week so far. That's an understatement, I know. I was on a call with other clergy colleagues earlier today in which we were able to talk with each other about how we're processing what has happened and what it means for us going forward. And someone said, we have the same country we had last week. We just know more about it now, which is, I think, something for us to really think about as we continue forward. Because when I think about how we place hope in our political leaders and even in other people to rise above self-interest and see the wider picture of what's happening and how their decisions and actions put other people in harm's way, when we place our hope in that, it can be devastating when we realize that self-interest will nearly always win, and we can become resigned. And I think that's the deeper lesson of the Hebrew scriptures. Governments are human-made, every one of them. Our faith, therefore, must be placed in God, not in a way that removes us from the equation, but in a way that puts us right in the middle of everything, that despite this fact that human governments are human, what are we called to do? We're always called to offer love. We're always called to offer compassion, to not get lost in the false promise of the world, but to keep returning to God again and again and again. So for now, let's be sure to be with each other as we navigate the coming weeks. Pay attention to those who are most vulnerable and call them up. Let them know you're there with them. Ask them what you can do. Tell them you love them and you care. For that is the reign of God incarnate, to know that we are not alone. Now stay tuned for your email for information on our wrap-up brunch, which will happen in a couple of weeks after the 10 a.m. worship service on November 24th. And for this week, I hope you'll stay after worship this Sunday for Bishop Netty's Forum on Hope, an incredibly important conversation for us to be having right now. And I'll see you next week for our final Bible study overview, and then for worship on the 17th. Until then, bye for now.